Good evening, everybody. Oh, that's a nice silence. Thank you very much. The University of Manitoba campuses are located on original lands of Anishinaabe, Cree, Oji-Cree, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation. We respect the treaties that were made on these territories. We acknowledge the harms and mistakes of the past, and we dedicate ourselves to move forward in partnership with indigenous communities in a spirit of reconciliation and collaboration. Thanks to the Seagram's Visiting Lecture Fund, which was established in 1981 by Joseph E. Seagram and Sons Limited, we are pleased to welcome another exciting speaker. In terms of reference, or the terms of references say, lecturers will be invited from around the world to the Faculty of Architecture at the University of Manitoba to speak on issues related to sustainable design. We don't always have to go far to invite exciting speakers. A few hundred miles are a decent distance, and we are honored to welcome Doug Olson, who is here tonight with his wife, Boo, and colleague. She graduated here as well from interior design. Doug is a speaker with a world of experience based on experiencing the world. And many thanks to the Faculty of Architecture for the support, but also thanks to Brandy and again Ainur. We will try to get through this evening together. A few words about our speaker tonight. Doug Olson holds a Doctor of Design degree, specializing in landscape planning from Harvard University, and a Master of Landscape Architecture degree from the University of Manitoba. He has served as an instructor at the Harvard University Graduate School of Design and is currently an adjunct professor in the School of Architecture, Planning and Landscape at the University of Calgary. He is a fellow of the Canadian Society of Landscape and received the CSLA Lifetime Achievement Award in 2017. For over 25 years as CEO of U2 Planning and Design, Doug directed the firm's work in landscape architecture, planning, and urban design. His projects at scales ranging from the region to the plaza have won multiple awards. He pioneered projects in the field of geodesign, coupling GIS modeling, and visualization with design and planning processes. He's currently the CEO of Safe Design Operations, where he focuses on multi-scale risk assessments and contemporary design that mitigates the risk and fear of crime. Additionally, he writes about the importance of regional landscapes. The lecture title for tonight, yeah, I think I'm right. You didn't change it. So, Understanding Landscape from Melancholy to Practice. That sounds very interesting, and I think we are all curious to hear more. Welcome, Doug.
Yep. Am I live? Yeah, you all hear me? Good. Well, thanks, Dietmar, for that introduction. It is great to be back here. It's been a while. I'm born and raised here, and having spent many years here, in both studying and working, I'm always glad to get back to Winnipeg. I promise you tonight will not be a tear fest. If you're looking for deep sadness, that's not what I'm going to be talking about. But really, I wanted to reflect after many years in practice. I've just recently, a couple of years ago, sold my firm, and I'm on to other things. But I'm really looking at what the importance of landscape architecture has been in both in my own life and perhaps to the world. And so I want to reflect on landscape change over the last 50 years. This is, we're talking about the 50th anniversary of this program. And I wasn't there at the very beginning, but shortly thereafter, I must admit. And there have been changes, profound changes in the world and in the landscape. I wanted to think about when I was doing this talk, I was going to do a very different talk than I normally do, and I wanted to reflect on what is it that we could do. How would we do it differently going forward? And I think one of the most important things that came to me was that ordinary people make landscapes, and that we have to really understand when we look at what we've lost in the past, how can we get people to really understand what we've lost, and that perhaps there would be a greater affinity to move more positively towards some tough decisions that we have to make in the future. And so how can we use melancholy in a sense of loss, as I said, there's not a Crimea River kind of talk, but how can we use a sense of loss to really see how we have to move forward? And it's a call for landscape architecture perhaps to be more relevant than it has. So having practiced a long time, done hundreds of projects at all different scales, I really think that we need to do better, and we're very well positioned to do better. So this is one of my favorite places in the world. Friends of ours have 900 acres at the head of the Exe River in Exmoor National Park. This is a human-made landscape. This is a working landscape. This is hill slope farming at its best. This is beach hedgerow country that is unparalleled. I like agroforestry, and this is an agroforestry landscape. But really, it's the outcome of ordinary people trying to make a living, doing ordinary things, making everyday decisions. And it's that accumulation in aggregate of multiple decisions by all kinds of people, your friends, your enemies, your neighbors, the people across the river. It's ordinary people who make the most impact. And those ordinary people also elect people who make decisions, who hire people to make decisions. And so it's really this idea that landscape is a cumulative result of ordinary people making everyday decisions as they try to make their livelihoods. I was also influenced in my career greatly by Richard Foreman, the giant of landscape ecology in North America. And he talked about landscape being a heterogeneous area that's composed of a cluster of different ecosystems interacting with one another over a very large period, a very large, broad area. So it wasn't that the pattern was exactly the same, but it was similar enough that it was repeated over at least a kilometers wide area. This is the whaleback in southern Alberta, described by wildlife biologists to me as being perfect elk habitat. If you had to design elk habitat, it would look like this. There's thermal cover, there's grasslands, there's little draws with water in it, there's shade, there's places for calving and so on. And true enough, there's like a gazillion elk in this area, and it's a really wonderful area. I want to emphasize also the dynamic, and you probably spotted the spelling error, but the dynamic relationship between pattern and process. And that's really what Foreman really was so well known for, of identifying that there are indispensable patterns in any landscape on Earth that provide predictable benefits. J.B. Jackson, another hero of mine who at this school, I had the pleasure of spending a day driving him around Winnipeg, showing him ordinary landscapes, vernacular landscapes, buildings that workers, regular people made. And that's what interested him so much, that landscape was really what ordinary people made, but that serves as the background for our collective existence, something that we all make together. John Stilgoe, who trained under Jackson and taught at Harvard as well, still teaching at Harvard, has written many books, talks about landscape as being a cultural invention. That really it's the collective work of the imagination that binds a people to a place and a place to its people. And this one line that he talks about in his book, What is Landscape? He says, landscape is fragile. Anyone who notices understands what children on the beach learn as the tide reaches for sandcastles. Natural forces still rule even over castles. So the idea that natural, and I know I'm speaking to the converted here, probably in a lot of ways. I'm sure you should know most of this stuff, but it's something that's very personal. I think you have to experience it. Stilgoe says, if you want to understand landscape, go for a walk, and just look around you, see how people have shaped the place. But really, this idea that it's not. These are man-made landscapes. They're almost all designed in some way. They're interacting with natural processes, but if you look at this place on the Middle Rhine, if you like Riesling, this is the place to go. But it's wonderful villages and settlements along the Rhine. These steep terraces built into the shale. Just wonderful example of designed landscapes interacting with topography and natural processes. And pattern matters. And it really does make a difference as to what the arrangement or configuration of the place is. We're looking at Richmond on Thames, the big King's Park. The park was the King's Hunting Park, and the wonderful areas along there, along the Thames over to Kew Gardens and so on. And the way that that's laid out and interspersed with the hard urban settlement areas really makes Richmond such a fabulous place. But the way we design something, the way we plan it, makes a huge difference. And I'm not talking about just the aesthetic experience, but the processes, the interactions between adjacent ecosystems, between people and open space. For instance, in this, if you had 10% open space here and you wanted to make it 25, well, you could do like the middle one, or you could do the one on the right, really convoluted and lots of interaction between the two types of spaces. So oversimplification, but pattern really does matter. But landscapes are changing, and there's only so many ways that it can change. And these are the big categories: settlement, infrastructure, linear infrastructure, particularly roadways, power lines, pipelines, et cetera, agriculture, forestry, mining, climate change, natural disturbance, and of course, war. So there's probably most things you could jam into one of those categories. And the impacts over the past 50 years, and this is not a tale of woe, but I think I'm going to tell a little bit of the woe of the last 50 years, because we are living in an age of unprecedented change. Nobody has ever lived through what we're going through and continue to go through. In 1973, the population of the world was 3.9 billion. Now it's just turned 8 billion. 61% of Canada's population was urban. Now 82% is. And between 1974 and 2014, more land was converted to settlement than in all of history. So this is, it's happening rather, that's a rather rapid change. Social impacts, people are dispersed by both land degradation, climate change, and war. Right now, the International Organization for Migration estimates there are 272 million international migrants worldwide. That's increased 50% in 20 years. Health, landscape changes have increased air and water pollution. I mean, I was in Saudi Arabia a while ago, and one of the big desert storms from Africa blew in. I mean, the health impacts of things like that, let alone climate change and migration of microbes and so on. They're saying that the climate change is expected to cause an additional 250,000 deaths annually by 2030. Now, that's the WHO. If you look at some more alarmist places, we're talking about hundreds of millions of people by the end of the century, but who knows? But let's say 250 is an underestimate, but we'll go with that. It's serious. Cultural loss, cultural heritage loss. This is war in Aleppo, of course. But we're talking about contested landscapes often leading to war. Climate change itself is causing serious threats to cultural resources and heritage sites around the world. This is an image that I used with permission from the Squamish Lillooet Cultural Center, and it was a show they did, or an exhibition they did on Truth and Reconciliation. I'm not going to go into all this other than if we talk about profound cultural impacts, certainly Indigenous people throughout the world due to changes in landscapes. I can't even speak to the impacts that's had. Economic resource depletion. Forest resource depletion alone is costing us, the world economy, over $2 trillion annually. Inequality. This is the United Nations Inequality Adjusted Human Development Index. We use it in our safe design risk analysis as well, because it makes a difference what kind of development level you have in a country, the rule of law, the inequality between people, the poverty level, education, and so on. Well, darker is worse. We're, for the most part, there is Canada and the northern Scandinavia, of course, have basically the highest levels of development and relatively equal in terms of distribution. But those who are in middle income and have suffered from a lot of economic loss and degradation in some of these countries, it really is falls on the shoulders of the poor. Environmental. This is a study that we did a few years ago of the mixed grass prairie across Canada, and we've lost about 80% of the original grassland in the world, about 81% in Saskatchewan, 60% in Alberta, 90% of the southern deciduous forest ecosystems in Ontario are gone. So it goes on and on and on. But this one, the mixed grass prairie, is one of the most highly disturbed ecosystems on the planet. You wouldn't think of it. We just drove across. There's not many people live there, but there's sure a lot of farming. Potholes, we lost 70% of the original potholes. Yet we don't even have a proper inventory of wetlands in this country. Climate change, we know what climate change is doing. I mean, I certainly do. I got flooded out in this flood. Land use planner, I live in the floodplain. But this was one of the largest impacts of natural disasters in Canadian history. And why did it happen? Well, yes, you've got climate change, of course, but we've also got destruction and loss of very important riparian habitats. Just a study we did looking at all the riparian areas in Calgary, all the health of them as well. And we've lost some, and there are some remaining, but most of them are in very poor condition. Not all of them, but many of them are. And this happens. So it flooded the entire downtown, basically. And there's a cost to this. There's 70 feet or 25 meters or 20 meters of riverbank, vertical, right in, lost on this. And this particular spot coincides with where where riparian areas have been lost or where they were in very poor condition. So we've got this loss over decades. And it's profound and it's continuing. So I won't try to go on too much about this, but why is it that we don't seem to notice? Well, there's the boiling frog syndrome, of course. These things are happening slowly, and we don't really notice things so much that are happening a little bit at a time. It's a death by 1,000 cuts. The cumulative effects aren't apparent to us either over time or space if it's slow enough. And so we need to recognize and respond to that. And how do we recognize this gradual and cumulative change in our environment and the impacts that they cause? How do we even recognize it? Little bit at a time. Like how quickly has the edge of Winnipeg or any city you can name expanded a little bit at a time, a subdivision here, a subdivision there, but when you look at it over 50 years, it's significant. But is there a way for us to kind of have enhanced psychological connection with this? And this is kind of where what this talk made me think about that I hadn't really thought about before. Like I've done all these projects, and there's usually a rationalism and an organization to it, which I absolutely agree with. For the most part, made some mistakes, but for the most part, I think we need to have a kind of rationalized, organized approach to broad scale planning. But what I noted was that somehow we're missing the connection to ordinary people. And I really think that the psychological response, if we tune people in somehow, if we lift their consciousness in some way, and I'm not trying to be preaching here, but I think it's just so important because ordinary people make landscapes. Ordinary people elect people who administer governments and make decisions and so on. And I think we need to somehow elevate the feeling that landscapes give us. And so we can emote, can trigger their feelings about how important these things are and how maybe they should contribute to a solution. And then we need to respond. So we have to understand, then we need to respond. And so the talk is from melancholy to practice, and I'll get to melancholy in a moment, but the idea that melancholy would trigger feelings and emotions and understanding and perhaps intellectual responses that would be effective in mitigating the change. So that respond is our own personal action, and I think the response is also incumbent on professional organizations. Now, I look at landscape architecture. I've always thought of landscape architecture and design as being kind of writ large across scales. all scales, and I love all of them. That's one of the downfalls of the profession, I think, is that it's if you do like it all, it's kind of hard to focus on it all, but they're all related. And so there's the professional involvement at multiple scales is necessary if we're going to change the world. And, we were talking, is this a kind of a change the world lecture? Yeah, I think it is to some extent. Do you want to change the world for the better? I mean, that's why I got into landscape architecture. It certainly wasn't to make money, but the idea that we could make a difference, and I didn't know how, and I'll speak to that in a moment. But so there's personal action that we can all take, whether we're designers or not. There's professional practice, and then there's this institutional barriers, because there's all kinds of reasons why negative change, I would call it, happens, and much of that has to do with institutional capacity, understanding, and so on. So how can we better understand landscape and loss? This is my favorite place on earth, and I worked and lived right there. And this is the sheep in west of Turner Valley, west of kind of slightly southwest, about an hour out of Calgary, actually. Most beautiful valley in the foothills, I think. Sheep, a Bighorn Sheep Wildlife Sanctuary, 400-foot canyon beneath this beautiful meadow. Escape terrain up to Missing Lake Mountain, where the peregrine falcons and the golden eagle's nest. I mean, it doesn't get any better. Lived up there for, the road was closed in the winter. My first son came from there. And so it's a wonderful place. Well, I left there and went to, and moved here to this school to take landscape. When they put the road through, they upgraded the road. That doesn't look like much of an upgraded road, but there's a big gorge creek crossing on the other side of that you can't see. That was a massive fill, like it was a 100-meter fill with a culvert in it, ruined. Wonderful place. Other places they just ruined along here. And I said to myself, well, right now I'm looking after a Bighorn Sheep Wildlife Sanctuary, doing some enforcement. I'd like to get involved in how to change, how to be. I want to be at the table. I want to be contributing, at least, if not at the table, at least contributing to what could change. And so I would, and what was happening there was heartbreaking to me. That was a motivator. And so it leads me to what the idea of melancholy. And I know there's philosophers in the room. So I will, and I'm speaking to this as a rank amateur when it comes to this. But the idea of melancholy, I started to examine just in the last few months. And in preparation for this talk, came to me in Istanbul, actually, and I'll get to that in a moment. But one of the things that I ask people in big regional planning or community plans even, but mostly in larger scale landscape planning projects, is if you came back to this place in 20 years and something was so radically altered or gone that it almost made you weep, what would that be? And that idea, and that to me, invokes melancholy. So, it's actually quite helpful in getting people to tell you what they care about and what they in a landscape. So, what is melancholy? Well, it can be both positive and negative. It isn't just I'm not talking about the melancholy that gets so deep that it leads to mental illness. I mean, that's a problem, agreed. But it's a complex state that really has this idea of a sense of loss, sadness, and introspection. You could call it a gap between yourself and the world. And it can be triggered by all kinds of things. And understanding what melancholy is triggered by, I think might be really a useful way of engagement with a broader public. Because I think triggering melancholy might trigger consciousness and caring about the places that they in fact themselves are changing, but don't maybe know it or aren't really aware of it. Because melancholy can increase our focus on values and what we really care about. I really care about this place, by the way. This is the Porkies, so the Porcupine Hills. Absolutely gorgeous place. And it did look like that on several nights. A little smoke in the air, but it was gorgeous. Okay. My son's a painter, and he turned me on to this etching, which is Durer's Melancholia 1. And because there's different types of melancholy. And it was posited that maybe this was the first type. And it's considered one of the most complex and enigmatic paintings or etchings, excuse me, in Western art history. It was done in 1514, so it goes back. It's really quite an interesting image. And what it is melancholia is this winged woman who's sitting there surrounded by all kinds of tools and implements and knowledge. There's her kind of carpenter's tools here. There's woodworking tools. There's some kind of polyhedron thing, which actually leads me to remember something that makes me melancholic is that you guys don't play ditch ball anymore. Does anybody know that in ditch ball you used to play with a multi-sided I forget even what it's called. Something somebody can speak up later and tell me, but you don't play it. It's too unsafe, I guess, to play ditch ball here anymore. It just makes me sad. But at any rate, there's this figure that this person has been able to, with all this intellect. She's got a magic square up. Oh, I can't point anymore. Oh, here it is. Magic square up here, where in every direction, the numbers add up to, horizontal, vertical, diagonals, the corners, the four corners in the middle, all add up to 34. They've created settlements in the background. There's shipping. There's artistic cauldron for goldsmiths and so on. And you've got all this knowledge, all these tools, and this person is sitting there and is unable to act with all the information. Can't seem to come to is fixed in inaction. And I thought that there's this kind of a state of lost inspiration, surrounded by the instruments of creative work, but sadly brooding with a feeling that she is achieving nothing. Kind of where we are right now in a lot of ways. So last year I went to Istanbul, and if you haven't been to Istanbul, you really should go. It's one of the most incredible cities. I just spent a few days there, and it was a tease. I want to go back and live there for 6 months. But to kind of get myself in the zone, I was reading Orhan Pamuk, the Turkish Nobel laureate. His book, the book is called Istanbul, Memories and the City, not memories of the city, but memories and the city. And it's nonfiction. And he's talking about this huzun. I'm probably not saying it right, but something like that, huzun. It is this special kind of melancholy that people in Istanbul feel with, and it's related to the kind of the lost glory of the Ottoman Empire, because they've been in decline for pretty much 200 years, in decline, losing a little bit more of the empire, blah blah blah, and then suddenly now sought with this modernity coming in and taking over. This is this huge suspension bridge that's right in behind this this mosque. And so you've got this juxtaposition of modernity and this incredibly rich Ottoman culture. And so kind of Huzun is this kind of state of limbo that they catch themselves in. And you know, this is what it was like. And it must have been amazing. But some of it's still there. I took this photograph and took a boat tour along the Bosphorus, and this palace over here is still there. But the skyline doesn't look like that anymore. And it was a wooden architecture largely, right? So burnt down. It's almost all gone. There are remnants of this, but all these cantilevered architecture, the streetways, it's incredible, wonderful place. And this feeling of Huzan is this melancholy that is deeply ingrained in the whole population. Well, maybe not the whole population, but a lot of people there relate to Huzan, this sense of loss. And nostalgia to a certain degree, but I'm not talking about nostalgia. I don't find nostalgia to be particularly useful. Understanding real value is pretty useful, and understanding that somehow things got screwed up or were impacted such that you lost something of value, that I get. But just, I wish it was like it was before. It doesn't really work anyway. So it's not very helpful. But what's different about this kind of melancholy is that it's communal. It's not just a personal thing. And the reason I was using Istanbul as a bit of a hub, and I picked my hotel room because it was close to jazz. I'm into jazz. They've got most incredible jazz scene in Istanbul. Like, it is exceptional. Way better than that you would think so for its scale, and that has so Huzun has really been useful. Many writers say in kind of cultivating an artistic, creative environment. And that's one of the positive things about this kind of what they call imaginative melancholy. And that's kind of what I'm talking about. I think melancholy is like the blues, right? The blues is, it can make you sad, but it's pretty inspirational sometimes too. And it allows a particular insight into the world. And I think when I look at this image, and I just snapped this out I was flying from Edmonton to Saskatoon and snapped it out. I said, God, that looks cool. And it's just a quick shot with my phone. And I just thought, God, look at this richness that's there. What is that story? What do I feel when I see that? I see this incredibly powerful forms and natural processes at work. They're obvious, but I see this grid overlaying it. The grid and the imposition of that grid is, J.B. Jackson would love it. I love this photo too, because it shows this kind of ordered grid over it, but there's also a tremendous loss underlain here in terms of what has been lost. I mean, we're talking about the prairies. This is actually a little bit more into the parkland, but still an incredibly diverse area, very rich, obviously very important, not all that far from, here, I guess it's probably about 50 miles from Batoche. And all of that, and all the people, I can't even speak to who use these, but obviously, rich area, potholes, grid, riparian areas, and livelihoods. This is a cultural artifact of very broad scale. So this can help us, this melancholy can help us understand landscapes by saying what's been lost, what caused it, what were the impacts, who are the winners and losers, It's interesting. Politicians and a lot of times the mandarins working for them will say, "Oh, we're not making winners and we don't want to make winners and losers here," when they're planning. Well, yeah, that's the name of the game. You are making winners and losers. When you plan to change something changes, somebody wins, somebody loses. So it's, and then what I was talking about, what do these landscapes mean to us emotionally? This is the tall grass prairie, 57 million hectares at one point from Texas to Manitoba. What is there left now? Like a half a block here in Winnipeg? Like it's literally 99% gone. Well, what can we do about that? Well, maybe not so much that, but there are things that we can do. And so now I'm going to say, okay, well, here's loss, here's melancholy, and now what do we do about it? What do we do about it as landscape architects? Well, I think the most important thing is to be able to identify values and connect people to landscapes and the values that underlay that landscape. We have to work across scales. I'll talk about each of these. I think we need to integrate landscape regionalism and ecological urbanism. I don't use the term landscape urbanism. I think it makes no sense to me. And I'll describe why in a minute. We have to use frameworks to organize projects and to aid decision-making. A framework is not a theory. A theory explains, a framework organizes. We have to organize this stuff. It's really complicated. You can break it down and do it systematically. For sure you can, it's doable, but it's complicated. And if you don't organize it properly, you'll never get it done. And then associated with that are the kind of the tools we have. Geodesign, the ability to incorporate GIS and modeling and so on into planning. We need spatial strategies for both development and conservation. We need to consider cumulative effects over time and space. And somehow, we don't do it now, we have to implement multi-jurisdictional, multi-scale design. And how can we do that? Well, we can try to do as much as we can through our own practice, which, even when you try really hard at it, this is a job for government, I think. That's my personal view. At the end of the day, we have to have institutional direction and institutional change that will really allow for multi-scale, cross-jurisdictional planning. But you start with values, people, and how decisions are made. How do ordinary people value those landscapes? We talked about that. How do you listen to them? How do you even get there? This, I really don't know. Like this, I think this is a really rich area for research. Like how can we get people to share with us their values? What and where? Like we've tried several tools of mapping, using interactive mapping, being able to drop pins and so on. But how do you get that out to hundreds, if not thousands of people? How are decisions made to change the landscape? Who's consulted, and what does consultation even mean? Is it just talk for talk's sake? Most of the consultation engagement processes that I go through, that I have to go through with municipalities like the City of Calgary, is perfunctory. It's performative. It's just like go through the exercise. Well, no, there are reasons for reaching out, but you want to ask questions that you want the answers to. The trouble is most engagement stuff, people don't want to ask those questions because they don't really want the answer. So that all kind of, how do you engage people to tell you what they think? And how do you use that information? What does it mean when you consult them or you engage them? Are you going to do anything with it? Usually not. And then how are the decisions made? Like who's at the table? Who has a veto? All those things are very important. And then, of course, you really have to design across scale because there is a nested hierarchy here. This is Saarnem's famous quote, always design a thing considering it in its next larger context, a chair in the room, a room in the house, a house in an environment in a city plan. And I would add the city and the regional landscape. So the regional landscape, city region, I think the most important planning scale on the planet right now, if you really want to make a difference. Like you can do fine scale work, and it's not unimportant. I'm not saying that at all. I think you have to work right across scale with examples right across scale. But if you really want to make a difference in the stuff that I was talking about at the beginning of the talk, it's at this scale, I think. So how do we think about this, where we live? It is, you can't separate it. That's why the concept of landscape urbanism is dumb, I think. And from a really, really super smart, articulate, well, if you believe in archibabble, a person. The idea that landscape is an urban construct and is really only about that is so limiting. We live in a region. This, Calgary, obviously, a great region, getting hammered left, right, and center, just terrible planning decisions all over the place at every scale. But we can't separate what we do in the city itself with the region. But there's different things we have to look at. We look at different processes at different scales. And how do we organize and develop methods for planning when we're trying to consider like everything all at once, as the movie says. Well, integrating landscape regionalism, ecological urbanism. So where you're looking at the region and you're being really, this is like high level, of course, but when you're looking at what do you do at the regional level, how do you respect at all levels, even how do you respect the region you're in? And with a real emphasis on pattern and process, landscape ecology. Ecological urbanism then is that is kind of environmental reciprocity, where we have both designed in natural systems and we both protect and receive benefits from. It sounds like hokum, but on so high level, but it's true. We, and the proof is in how we do it, of course, but that's, I think, what we should aspire to, is blending this idea in the notion of the regional landscape, and within the regional landscape is embedded urban form. Talking a little bit about how do we organize this work. And so I'm going to organize it based on a geodesign framework. Now, geodesign, Carl Steinitz is the man on that, who has he has a whole framework. I was thinking of showing you that one, but I thought better of it. This is enough. A whole framework for organizing what you do, from understanding how decisions are made, what values you consider. But basically this follows his framework. So I'm just going to go through it. You really, first of all, as I said, you understand what values you care about and you're going to use in your decision frameworks. You understand and identify those. You go and get the data for them. You build a bunch of models that in GIS, usually some are spatial, some are non-spatial. You build a bunch of models so that you can evaluate both the existing conditions and the future conditions. And you run those models against different alternatives. And so you can see the change from now till the future, given the different alternatives. And so you've got this environment, and then you pick one, or you make whatever your decision model is, whatever it is. And I'm not suggesting that I've got I'm going to tell you, it's not a modified Delphi or whatever. There's all different kinds of decision models. Sometimes it's the king making the decisions. But the idea that you would have a framework of to organize your work, and that you would use GIS and modeling to inform complex scenarios and evaluate both and their impacts across over time and space isn't something you do with trace or in your head. So there's lots of things you could do there. So I'm going to give some examples from across scales, really touching the tips of the waves on all of these, obviously. But the Halifax Green Network Plan. So this is Halifax, it's about, I think, close to 100 kilometers across, maybe 60 kilometers top to bottom. It's cranked here. It's not north, but an incredible area. We were doing the regional plan a few years ago. And we went out, we engaged people in all kinds of different ways. And we went, our dog and pony show all around the Halifax region, not just for the city of Halifax, for the whole region. And we had the map. This kind of starburst thing here is just one way of it. They've got something like, 9,000 people submitted comments about what they thought were important in which areas, and this is just a graphic trying to make sense of it. I don't know what it's telling me actually right now, but we did try to listen to people, and we did try to model, and we put together a whole set of a very good database on ecology, working landscapes and livelihoods, recreation, how communities might be shaped, and cultural landscapes, and so on. Put all these things together. We did modeling, really complicated modeling about how wildlife moved through the area and so on. And then we came up with what is basically Richard Foreman's indispensable patterns. Maintain really large patches of relatively unfragmented vegetation, native vegetation, protect well-vegetated riparian corridors, provide stepping stones across altered landscapes, and then maintain the very special individual point kind of things that are really special across the landscape. If you do that, you don't have to do too many other things, because all of the collateral benefits that come from that indispensable pattern are enormous. And they protect things like species at risk and all that. Although if you have species at risk, man, you put that into the mix too. But so we came up, and I would call this landscape regionalism. Similarly, in the Saskatoon area, we did the plan for the region of Saskatoon, a non-binding plan, by the way, which is non-binding. There's no kind of imposition from Saskatoon or the province. There were 5 municipalities around Saskatoon. When I came into it, they were barely speaking to one another. Well, that's a bit unfair, but I mean, let's say that there was a lot of conflicts between them, and so I sent as a Christmas gift, because we were starting it in January. I don't know if you're aware of the heard of the book called Getting to Yes. It's out of the Kennedy School at Harvard. It's a negotiating way, how you should base things on you should try to move forward in win-win situations, but where you understand what it is that the other guy or other person is trying to achieve, what they value. And so get that on the table first. Get principles on the table first. So the first steps we had, what's the vision for the area? And what are the principles upon which we should base this plan? And we didn't get to the solution. We wanted to say, okay, what's going to drive this plan? What's important to us? And so we did that. And you know what? That's easy. it's usually pretty easy for people to say, oh yeah, I want to protect livelihoods and biodiversity and all that. Then you just start drilling down, of course, more and more, or we want to be able to accommodate 1 million people in this area in the next 50 years, which is what it was supposed to do. So we tried to understand the region. We understood first what are the principles of the plan. How are we going to judge plan A versus plan B? And then we went out and got data sets and so on. And what we did first, though, we said we did a defensive strategy. The defensive strategy is, what do we want to keep in the area in the very long term? We should ask people those things and get them to show us where they are, what they are, where they are, why are they important to them. So what's the expression? The first rule of intelligent tinkering is to keep all the parts. And so what we wanted to do was, before we did any kind of growth strategies about spatial distribution of new land uses and development, et cetera, let's figure out what we want to keep in the long term. So we did that, and then we used that. Oh, well, I'll start here. But we did a bunch of modeling too. A really interesting area. This is there's Saskatoon, and you see all this area up Martinsville and Warman, and that's just 100 mil event. That's like nothing. That's well, it's not nothing. It's actually quite a lot, but it's regularly occurs, right? Regularly occurs. Well, what happens if you get a 300 mil event? It's all internally drained. It just doesn't want to go anywhere, right? I mean, there's the South Saskatchewan River over here, and there's these old channels. I guess I can use this. There's these old river channels, and the slight depressions and so on. Well, people want to build in these areas. Well, talk about folly. It's crazy to do that. And this area has been a lot of this. This is 300 mil. That hasn't happened, but 200, I believe, has. And don't build there. So as I said, maybe I didn't say it yet, but I said it to Dietmar earlier tonight, that what has become more apparent to me is where we shouldn't build. What to keep, where we've got, it's not like we're short of land. We've got tons of land. I mean, tons. But we don't have tons of biodiversity. We don't have tons of drainage channels, because if you interrupt some of these drainage channels, the knock-on effect and the opportunity costs of not being able to use it to drain other areas, which might be to your economic advantage because you want to develop somewhere that would be appropriate, but you'd like to drain into some of these areas, which people do. So it's a matter of what do you keep and what do you protect, and then what do you build? And so that was our concept. And we had potholes and drainage channels and special areas and the cultural heritage places and so on. And then we painted in just a really high level zoning, right? Really high level density, in some cases, not even density, just where you're going to build. And we had background ideas as to what the densities might be. And those are different considerations. This was not about making a great place. This was not making the Forks or something at a finer scale. It was just saying, do this first, figure out that other stuff later at a different scale. Similarly, in the Green Network, we did the Parks Plan, and then we did the Green Network through Edmonton. And so we did the same kind of thing, layered network of all kinds of things, ecology, cultural considerations, urban infrastructure, and so on. And we mapped it all. And we mapped it at a pretty fine scale, actually. I just showed you a broad scale map, but this has been really informing parks development and protection and open space network planning throughout the city. And it also connects it to the region, because here you've got, you know, the ribbon, they call it the ribbon of green. That's another plan that we did, or that O2 did through there. No longer me, but I was involved in that. All these projects I was involved in heavily. But it connects to the region. You can see Elk Island Park out here and how we might connect things, you know, along the Athabasca River. And so a lot of these areas are critical at the broader scale. And if you snip them off, because you want to do something cool here and not, then the opportunity cost may be enormous in terms of other aspects. Okay, switching scales here a little bit. I want to talk about ecological urbanism. This is a gravel pit along the Bow River that was mined for years. Well, the inspiration for this was, well, there was an engineering component. They wanted to drain a watershed above about, I think, 2,500 hectares or something like that, a broad area above it to drain water down, treat stormwater before it got into the Bow River. And not huge events, but kind of everyday events. So it would treat the water before it got into it, you know, a beautiful trout-bearing stream, the Bow. So that was the initial idea, but it needed to be more than that. And so my inspiration for this was kind of fluvial processes and how they kind of the strange forms that they can give. So these are called anabranches, these kind of side channels that develop, and they impact vegetation. This isn't the site itself, but you can see how the fluvial forms and the flooding at different levels cause different, what look like very designed forms, very strict, you know, it's not iggly squiggly naturalism, but and it's something that I hate in design is when you do kind of iggly squiggly design that has no real foundation to it. But these were some of the basics for it, and then we got just an early sketch of, and there were some other really great engineers involved that developed the you know, this kind of nautilus pond, this circular settling pond, and so on. There's some and landscape architects as well, Bernie Emile and others. But the concept of the forms was derived from what I just spoke to you about, and then it led to this you know, different polishing marshes, settling ponds, and so really a functional wetland machine. But it's really it's obviously designed. And it was, you know, that was the thing. I insisted that this thing had to be obviously designed, because if it was iggly squiggly, it was going, oh, what's that? Just fake naturalism? This is a machine, and it's got all kinds of functions to it, you know, pathways through it. It's cool. Another one, a similar or different project, West Eau Claire Park. Now that's underwater. You know, that earlier shot that I showed you of Calgary underwater, that and this whole area flooded, like downtown flooded. And so, and here is the Peace Bridge here, and that was a 1 in 100 year event, right? 1 in 100 year, which, like, there was a 1 in 500 year event south of town on Willow Creek a few years back. So these things happen, and the project I'm going to show you right now will not protect to the 1 in 500. It'll protect to the 1 in 200. But so we did a plan, and it's been constructed. It started out as concept, where we would build flood protection all the way along here. And here's the Peace Bridge. And the idea, I actually got it from just looking at air photos of deltas, satellite images, and so on. There's one in Russia, actually, that really got to me, and it's a famous one, the Volga River. I'm not sure. Anyways, northern Russia. But these forms are just so beautiful, I thought. And there's 7,000 people a day come across the Peace Bridge and go downtown, and then we wanted a place for them to linger as well. And it's been built, and it's very, people seem to like it. It's, how ecological is it? Well, it's ecological in that it interfaces with the natural process. It's growing. Okay, so summary and wrap up. So we've got losses continuing, and we need to have effective design. Who's going to do it? I don't know. Hopefully landscape architects, but if not you, somebody else, I hope. And I hope that it's people that are trained broadly and understand multidisciplines and aren't doing it for their own sake. That's design at the scales that we've been talking about is not just an idea you had, like the Delta Garden. You can't do that at regional scales. All right. It's got to be a lot more than that. Now, maybe there's ways to get in, land art at a huge scale. But I don't think that's not what I'm talking about. We need to be engaged at the scale that things are changing. Planning is a political act. The broader the scale, the higher the stakes. You better know that. Better learn to negotiate. Better learn to get to yes if you want to be effective. We have all these tools. Like we've got all the, everybody's, you talk to scientists quite often, we need more data and so on. Well, yeah, I would at least like to have a decent wetland inventory. That's true. But how good an inventory? It'll never be good enough. So we got data. We have incredible tools now. You could never do this. You could not do this stuff. You could, the McCarg, remember McCarg and all his overlays and that? Well, you can't do that at this scale. It doesn't work. It's too complicated. You can't interpret it. He couldn't. When you look at his New York studies and that, it's a mess, right? Great ideas, terrific ideas. The tools weren't ready. They are now. Geodesign, GIS, et cetera. If you don't use them, don't work at the scale because you're like, why would you? Why would you not use them? But we don't have the political will or the institutional capacity. And how do we get that? We need public connections to landscape, need to be leveraged, get people out there saying how much they care about this, that, and the other thing, and that we must protect them, or pushing politicians to go for more intelligent planning. And public institutions at all kinds of different scales, whether they're First Nations, municipalities, the province, the feds, EIA agencies, they need support because they don't know how to do it. They really don't. Or because, we joked about the overused term, get out of your silos and all of that, but it's true. And very, very few people are actually coordinating this. So I think landscape architects need to be trained in multidisciplinary, multi-scale, multi-jurisdictional planning and design. And when I say design, I mean design. That's stuff for Saskatoon. That's design. It's at a broad scale, but it is design. It's not just like planning and design. To me, is one verb, different scales, and we must. I think we must take some creative, bold solutions. Now, on that note, my bold solution, as simple as it is, and I'm wrapping with this, that we need a major new initiative. I'm calling it the Landscape Project, for lack of a better term. It would be managed by a partnership of provincial, federal, and First Nations to provide landscape planning support to all levels of government. It will not be a decision body unless, I'm made king for the day. Then it would be. But it was, that's not happening. It's not meant to be. It'll be the kiss of death if we say it's a decision making, that we're trying to wrest authority from some institution or not. But it will facilitate better decisions by others, however they make those decisions. And you'll win some and you'll lose a lot. But it'll be better than it is now. So the intent is not to regulate, but to provide to support decision making. It'll collate and distribute national data sets and provincial data sets. It'll develop processes, geodesign tools, policy guidance, pull all this information, all the information that the Environmental Impact Agency and that has, all of the objectives and policies, really look at them, collate them, compare them, do the work, the really hard research work of getting this together, and liaise with governments with respect to what their policies and objectives are for, I'll call it a whole bunch of stuff. All of it, all of the big items. It will have geodesign, environmental impact, cumulative effects built into the planning process. It'll carry out pilot projects in partnership with First Nations and other levels of government, and it'll make the results public. And that's something that politicians hate, right? Because they usually don't like to be held accountable. And this kind of thing will make people more accountable because the impacts of decisions will be more transparent. And we have to coordinate research efforts. I think all of the research efforts in certain areas, and we're talking about providing funding in this project, you'll see what the funding is, that we would coordinate research activities across universities across this country. And certainly I would expect that this department and others, landscape architecture departments, would participate in that. So we train professionals in geodesign, project management, because great new book out on why big projects fail. And it just talking about, like, you need experience. You can't have, I'm sorry, you can't have 28-year-old kids just out of school running, hundreds of millions of dollars projects. And those kinds of things are happening. There has been an institutional memory loss with the retirement of people, but I think we need to really, really build capacity here, build capacity both in research in this landscape project, but also more importantly in the various levels of government. And as I said, they have to know about facilitation and negotiation. It's a $500 million project, just the way I blue skied it, right? Well, what's that? I drove there's an intersection outside of Calgary in the new ring road, $250 million for one intersection. Now it's, kilometers across. It's like nuts. But your average intersection on a major freeway, although you don't have too many of those here, is $60 million. So, or 4 F-35s, and that's not counting maintenance or the bases that they fly out of. So, it's cheap at twice the price, and maybe it would be twice the price. The question is this. What is the cost of not doing it? It's more of the same, and maybe it'll be slower, maybe. Anyway, and this is a quote, Sherry Rabinovitz and Laurie Bond made this thing, and artists need to create on the same scale that society has the capacity to destroy. Okay. Questions? Hearing none? Yes.
As far as the
The big project?
big project,
Yeah, then it's just pipe dream. Yeah.
I
Okay.
know. But the trick there is we have political bodies that have 4-year periods. You had a 5-year. And how do we maintain consistency going from one political administration to another?
Yeah, I mean, there are all kinds of challenges.
Yeah.
There are all kinds of challenges, and I don't deny that it's a daunting task. But I'll tell you this: if you don't ask, you don't get. And the most interesting projects I've ever done were unsolicited. When I came back from Harvard, I saw a need for landscape planning. And I proposed that we do a pilot project in we call the Southern Rockies, about a 5,000 square kilometer area. And that we do an integrated regional landscape planning pilot project. And it was going to cost $750,000. And this was like 97 or something like that. They went for it. And then we did another project, the Northern East Slopes Environmental Management Strategy, another attempt at this kind of thing. Like it was a bigger area. And that formed the basis for regional planning, the resurgence of regional planning in Alberta. So and the most recent regional plans are highly political and dumbed down sometimes to the point of the prescriptions are basically harmless. And that's kind of painful, but at least it's moving in the right direction. And so I don't know how you get around these things. I think you try to make these non-denominational. They're not non-political. They are apolitical. They are political by their very nature. And I think that's a good thing, actually. I think it is a good thing. I'd rather, well, I don't know. It just depends who you have running the show, I guess. But it's usually beats the alternative. But we've got to somehow show the benefits. I think there's only a few things that politicians really care about. Some things they have to look after by law, like water, like water. Then there is the cost of public infrastructure. And then there's economic development. So you've got to make a case in the evaluation models that you're doing that you're meeting at least all of those three things. And they don't really care about the others, most of them, but there are collateral benefits to be gained if you achieve those. So you've got to be smart about it. And that's why I say it's a negotiation strategy. It's a getting to yes, because we are all responsible for this. You know, people, what do they say? People get the governments they deserve. I think people get the landscapes they deserve. If we're not willing to get up there and do something about it, then go home. Let somebody else get up to the plate. And I'm saying, so yeah, people are going to whine and cry. I think you need champions. We need smart government. Maybe this would be a good platform, because just think about how many projects are tied up in an interminable impact assessment process and then don't even happen, right? Like the cost of doing that. I mean, that one pipeline, whether you believe in pipelines or not, I do. I'll say that it's just better than trains. But if you believe in them or not, the cost of doing these impact assessments is like hundreds of millions of dollars. And then the process gets, then the, so some predictability and coordination and better impact assessments because it's placed in a context. So everybody could feed into it. I'm not saying you can't go ahead, you can or can't go ahead with the pipeline. That's somebody else is going to make that decision. Well, in this case, like you've got the EIA people, but there's a lot of problems with the way they do it, and they're the first to tell you that. So I think there are different ways. So what's the expression? Think slow and act fast. So I think that, so you saw the budget there up until I got to the landscape project, the pie in the sky, the dream. It's not fleshed out at all. I have experience, many other people have experience in all kinds of components of that. Let's spend 2 years really fleshing it out, really thinking about it, really scoping the project, making it doable, and then incrementally adding into it and building on it and get agreement. So we at least have like a decent data set in this country. Like it's terrible. You compare us with the States in terms of the data that's available. This is like we're in the dark ages. It's shameful. So I think that I think this is a real long shot. But having said that, what's the alternative? Go home, do the same thing, piecemeal, death by 1,000 cuts. You can sign up right behind me. No. No. Yeah.
Thank you. Take on questions from the floor, but also to mention, your talk is live streamed. There are quite a few people in the audience. So all the people in the audience, if there are comments or questions, we can take them as well. Do we have in the chat? So I'm not really sure. Is there a question from the floor, or Ainur, if you want to go ahead, do you want to read them? Thanks.
Yeah, there's 2 questions in here. The first is from Aaron. He's asking, what tips or advice would you offer to landscape architecture students interested in working at the regional scale?
Learn as much about many disciplines as you can. And hopefully you're at a school that has some focus on the regional scale. There are schools that do. Penn State, Penn Design or University of Pennsylvania, both of those are excellent. Harvard used to, not so much anymore, but to some extent. Utah State, and this school, I don't know. I really don't know what the focus is now on regional. I know it used to be pretty good, and certainly got me going in terms of interest in it. But it was Carl Steinitz who really drove it home to me. And so I would, if the book I would read it's out. I think it's Esri Press, and it's a framework for geodesign by Carl Steinitz. Read the Bibles like Landscape Ecology by Richard Foreman, Landscape Mosaics, and so there's private reading you can do, but start with geodesign. By the way, there is a whole geodesign collaboration right now, and get involved with that. Start a geodesign project here at this school. I know that Carl has a major project of all universities around the world right now doing exploring different ways of geodesign. So you should look at on the Esri website, the Geodesign Collaborative Project, and that. So that would be a major source of inspiration. You can see the schools that are involved. Minnesota, University of Minnesota has a presence in Arizona. Anyway, you look at all the collaborators. It's all the schools and different institutions that are collaborating on this project, a worldwide project to compare methods. So there are people doing this.
The second question is from Chelsea. It says, I very much enjoyed hearing your perspectives, especially the discussions about the regional scale. Given that many of the requirements to become a landscape architect in Canada are focused on detailed design, what would your advice be to students or young professionals working towards becoming landscape architects that are interested in the regional scale? Do you see alternative paths for those with regional interests?
Sorry, the last sentence, please.
Do you see alternative paths for those with regional interests?
Well, part of the problem is that there's only so much time at school, but you've got a whole profession ahead of you, and I don't think it's one or the other. Like I actually do really enjoy detailed design at the project scale. I find it more challenging and more interesting in some respects at the regional scale. And I've done it all. It's hard though. It's hard if you're in a small firm to do that. You have to be in a bigger firm if you want to be able to work across scale. There's firms here in the city, in Winnipeg, that HDFC, if that's what they're still called. But my first firm, Hildman Whitty, Crosby Hanna, but that are working across scales. Yeah. So there are firms that do it. Design Workshop, have a look at what they're doing. Some pretty cool stuff. And they work in Canada too. They do all kinds of work. Arancha Munoz, a Spanish architect and landscape architect who did basically geodesign for the United States in terms of trying to, for Esri. She's an incredibly smart lady and does really wonderful work. Some of the large engineering firms tend to do some of this stuff now. And we were talking today, quite often, unfortunately, when you get to that scale, it's like that I think the idea of what landscape architecture is somehow stopping after you, if you're on a project that doesn't have working drawings. I think we need to realize the kind of the deep basis of the practice of the profession. Excuse me. And what a friend of mine said something the other day. He said, landscape architecture is like psychiatry. It was originally really a promising field, but it's in need of revitalization. And I think that is the case right now. At least now it sounds like sour grapes or something. It's not sour grapes at all. It's a perspective. I just see, I mean, I love to see, these vital little blocks fixed up and all of that, and cool design and beautifully detailed. And I enjoy it as much as the next person. But that should not say that that's what landscape architecture is now. Is basically, it's not all fine scale work. It is broad scale too. And that is design. And it's very, very important design.
Thank you for the presentation. You mentioned the big E word.
The what?
You mentioned the big E word, engineers.
Yeah.
a moment ago.
Yeah.
In the 90s, when the big engineering firms, civil engineering firms were buying out the landscape architecture firms, I thought that this was the beginning of a fantastic new hybrid profession that would address that scale and those issues. And it didn't happen.
Yeah.
Why is that?
That's a good question. Perhaps it's the management structure, organizational structure of firms, of many of those firms, but still some of them are doing, there are Happold, Arup there's an example of a great engineering firm. I think one of the best you could imagine would be doing good work. So they're not all like that. But yeah, maybe it's the corporate model. Maybe I don't know. I can't really blame the engineers. I like working with engineers. I really do like working with engineers. Preferable to some other professions sometimes. But because the thing is about what I like about engineers is they know what they don't know. And in fact, some other professions don't have a clue of what they don't know. They can do everything. So it's really, I think that I think we got to blame ourselves. I think we've got to be more articulate, not forceful, but articulate and make good arguments and have a vision for how you could take landscape architecture, say at the scale we're talking about, in the and blending it, and you want to blend it with engineering, which like that's what people are doing, right? Some people are doing that. You've got to be able to sell it. And I mean, it sounds crass, but you do have to be able to sell it both internally inside a firm as well as to clients. I mean, most professional firms they're in business. They have to make money. Engineers make a lot of money because they can, rinse and repeat, right? It's we got 50 miles of pipe to lay, and it's all pretty much the same. And we're going to make 6% on that or whatever. And so, but you want to take something and advance some ideas. You want to do some R&D on it. I don't know I wouldn't just blame, I certainly wouldn't blame the engineers for it. I don't know. But I think I do think it can be done. I think there are engineering firms that are really doing great work at all different scales and very, very successful. What is the word? Happold, I think, is the name of the firm, British firm, UK firm, doing incredibly interesting work. And they've got landscape architects, but they've got the kind of landscape architects who aren't just, they're not going to, do planting plans just, or, they won't accept that kind of, I think the problem is, as I see some of the problems with landscape architects, is that we have accepted work we should never have taken. You're not going to do that. I mean, we have to be able to say, I'm sorry, I don't do sheep dip. I'm not going to do that. And don't do it. It gives us all a bad name. And so it rests on our shoulders to take things forward. Nobody else's. And I think the schools really need to look at their programs, and they're shorter programs now. Often, we don't have so many undergrad programs, like 4-year programs, undergrad programs. And so everything's, the funding is there for master's programs, 2-year master. How can you, sometimes 3 years, but how could you possibly learn this field in 2 or 3 years? Like, what does it take? I mean, especially if you want to roll in all the stuff that I was just talking about today and be a really competent designer. I mean, I feel for some people, you've got to go and write the Larry and all of that. And basically, you better know your bolt patterns and all of that. And okay, that's important for that kind of work. Maybe there ends up being a split or, where you are doing more, calling it landscape planning. And it's always when you write landscape planning and design, like my firm was O2 Planning and Design. Even I couldn't bring myself to say that it was all landscape architecture. It's hard to sell because people don't know what landscape architect, more ordinary people, news at 11, nobody knows what landscape architecture is. Well, very few, I'm sorry. So let's get it out there. Let's get it more relevant.
You didn't talk to it. And I think if we're talking about students and thinking about regionalism, one thing that's very important is that students get out of the city and learn about the region that they live in.
Yeah, John Stilgoe said it very, like, go for a walk. Go for a walk.
Yeah.
And read about like what it is that people call things. His book is What is Landscape is a terrific book. It's basically, it derives words and why do people call things what they do. The word landscape, at one point, like landschaft, they talk about that, a collection of cultivated fields. It also in Dutch means a shoveled field. It's shoveled. So all the, just getting out, you're right. You're absolutely right. Getting out, there's no, it's like designing something if you haven't been to the site, understanding landscape. And how do you do that? Especially if it's, 20,000 square kilometers. I like 5,000 square kilometers, my favorite scale, actually. You can really design that. But if you don't get out and see it and understand it and talk to people, talk to farmers, talk to developers. Okay, good. Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you very much, Doug, for being here tonight and for your thoughts on melancholy. I know I pronounced it the wrong way. So I'm glad to see that you never got depressive so far. So what I take with me, there's something positive. I would call it the positive sadness we can use for our advantage and for our creativity. So thank you very much. And yeah, maybe there's a chance. I think you know many people here in the audience, and maybe we'll stay here for a few more minutes. Sure. I guess you are available for
absolutely. Yeah, no,
some small conversations. Thank you very much for coming, and have a good night.